Hi, welcome to my channel and thank you to my subscribers. In this video, we are going to see how to build a Spring Boot web application from scratch and then add an authentication layer to that web application by integrating that application with Auth0 as the identity provider using the OpenID Connect protocol. So Auth0 is one of the most widely used identity providers, especially in the consumer identity and access management domain. And it was bought by Okta a few years back. So, so it's a very famous identity provider. It's used by many organizations. So before getting into the configuration steps in Auth0 and also building a Spring Boot web app from scratch and integrating with Auth0, I will quickly go through the flow, the OpenID Connect flow between the Spring Boot web app and Auth0 using this diagram. So if you look at this diagram, when the user tries to access the web application in a browser, the web application will then redirect to the identity provider, which is Auth0 in this case. So it is a browser redirect. And once it redirects to Auth0 and Auth0 shows the login page and the user enters the Auth0 credentials, Auth0 will validate the credentials and again redirect back to the web application in step number 6. So if you look at the step number 6, that's where Auth0 redirects back to the Spring Boot web application with an authorization code in the URL query parameter. And the Spring Boot web app will then read that authorization code. And then in step number 7, it will call the token endpoint in Auth0, which is a backend API call. It's not a browser based call. So until now, everything happened in the browser. And once the Spring Boot web app receives the authorization code, it calls the token endpoint in Auth0, which is a backend API call. And then it will get the access token, ID token, and an optional refresh token depending on what scopes you pass to Auth0 in the initial authorization request. And Spring Boot web app will then validate the tokens in step 9. And this validation includes multiple things, like it will validate if the signature of the JWT token or the opaque access token is valid by reading the certificate from Auth0's JWKS URL and then validating the signature. And then it will validate multiple other things like expiry, the token expiry value, the tokens issuer, all those things. So Spring Boot framework takes care of all those validations. And once the token is valid, the Spring Boot web app can display the home page or deny access to that user. So that entirely depends on how you write the business logic in your Spring Boot web app. So you can use the token claims and then build your own application authorization logic within your Spring Boot web app to allow or deny access, or to allow access and show certain features and hide certain features. So you can build any logic that you want within your Spring Boot web app. But we are not going to see all those things in this demo. This demo will focus on building a Spring Boot web app from scratch and then doing configuration on the Auth0 side to integrate that Spring Boot web app with Auth0 using the OpenID Connect protocol. So that's what we are going to see in this demo. So it is very important that you understand this end-to-end flow before getting into the configuration steps, because once you understand this flow, it is very, very easy to build the application and understand how the user journey works, like starting from accessing the web app to authentication and then accessing the home page of the web app. So now let's get into the configuration steps. But before that, please don't forget to subscribe to this channel and support this channel. And thanks in advance for subscribing. So if you look at Auth0, I have already logged into my development profile of Auth0. So you can register for a free Auth0 account. You can then access your account using your Gmail account, your Gmail username and password. So it's free, the development. So if you look at here, it shows development, right? So it's the good thing is Auth0 provides developer accounts. So you can just go to the Auth0 website or search in Google for Auth0 developer account and then sign in using your Google credentials, which is Gmail credentials, and you will get a Auth0 development instance or tenant, whatever you call it. And then you can play around with this development tenant for all your proof of concepts and for your learning purpose. So I already have a developer account and I'm going to use the same development account. And the other thing is I'm going to use Spring Tool Suite. So I'm going to use a Spring Tool Suite for actually building the Spring Boot web application. And this is a very, very nice IDE if you are working on Spring based projects, but there is no limitation on which IDE you need to use. You are free to use whichever IDE you are comfortable with, whether it's Eclipse, whether it's IntelliJ, whether it's Spring Tool Suite or anything else. So let me actually quickly create a new workspace to start with, and then Spring Auth0. Let me call it as demo 2. I already have one, so I will start with a new. So the, you can check the while the Spring Tool Suite is provisioning the new workspace. Let me quickly just go through certain things in this Auth0 console. So this is the homepage of the Auth0 management console. And then you can see the list of users. I already have some users created here, and you can go ahead and create a test user for testing this demo at a later point of time. So you can create the users here, and then these are the applications that you create. So basically what application means is, for example, in this case, we are building a Spring Boot web app and integrating with Auth0. And when the Spring Boot web app redirects to Auth0, Auth0 needs to understand where the request is coming from. Like whether the request is coming from the Spring Boot web app that I built, or whether the request is coming from some other web application which is hosted in some other place. So in order to identify the application from where the login request is coming, you need to create an application for that which represents your Spring Boot web app or whatever it is. So actually I'm going to delete the existing application. Looks like they have some limits on the number of applications that you can actually create, and I already maybe reached that limit, so I'm going to delete my old application. Hopefully that should enable the create application button. Yes, so you should see the create application button enabled. I think there is some limit on the number of applications, so if you reach that limit it will get disabled. You can obviously you can go ahead and delete one of your test applications and you will see the create application button again. So as I said, here you create a profile for your web application for Auth0 to identify from where the authentication request is coming from. And we will see how to do that in subsequent steps. So now let's go to the Spring Tool Suite. So the workspace is created. It's a totally new workspace from scratch. So before getting into the step-by-step instructions, kindly go ahead and search for Spring Boot OAuth2 in Google. So if you search for Spring Boot OAuth2, you will see some links like the first one, the second one. Open both the links in two different tabs. I have already opened it here because we need these documentations for reference for building our application. So this link out of one of those links is actually a blog where it explains how to integrate a Spring Boot web app with OAuth2. But there is a catch here. This blog is slightly old. So some of the instructions will still work and some of the instructions won't work with the latest Spring Boot version. So we are going to only pick and choose few things from this blog and then use the latest documentation for the remaining things. So let's scroll down here and let's come back to this at some point at a later point of time. Just scroll down to this add a home page and just keep it open. And now let's go back to the Spring Tool suite and create a new Spring Starter project. So click create new Spring Starter project. You can name it as anything. In my case, I will name it as SB Auth0 demo, which is basically a Spring Boot Auth0 demo. Don't forget to change this type to Maven. If you are comfortable with Groovy, go ahead. But I'm comfortable with Maven, so I'm selecting Maven and it is easier to maintain. So whichever you prefer. If you're really comfortable with Groovy, go ahead with that. That is no issue. But this demo uses Maven. Click next. Here, search for OAuth2. Sorry, not OAuth2. Search for security and select Spring Security and OAuth2 client. And then select web. Select Spring Web option. So here you will see all the three selected libraries, the Spring Security, the OAuth2 client, and the Spring Web libraries. Click Finish, and it will take a minute to provision the project, compile the source code, and then build the source code. Let's wait for that. I think it's almost done. So you can now open this pom.xml, and here you will see all the libraries that we selected while creating the Spring Boot starter project. So the starter security, the starter web, and these are some test packages. And this OAuth2 client package. So these are the three packages that we selected in the Spring Boot starter wizard. And you see all these three dependencies automatically added to your pom.xml, and it automatically provisioned the Spring Boot project with a main application class. You can see here this is the main Spring Boot application class. So now we have the basic project, the Spring Boot starter project. Now we need to add additional enhancements to this project to integrate it with Auth0 identity provider using the OpenID Connect protocol. Before doing that, let's actually rename this application.properties to application.yaml. So Spring Boot supports both properties format as well as the YAML format. And again, as I said earlier, in many cases, if you are comfortable with the properties format, go ahead and use the properties format. I am more comfortable with the YAML format. It is very easy to read, and all the documentations that you see here in the Spring Boot websites or in the blogs use the YAML format. So if you scroll down here, everything uses YAML format. So just rename the properties to YAML. And now let's go back to this blog. And in the home page, it says add a index.html page under the src main resources static folder. So go to your project, select this static folder, right click new file, index.html, and copy this and paste it here. So our first step is done. And if you scroll down a bit, you can go through line by line instructions later, but if you scroll down a bit, it says we need to add these dependencies to our pom.xml. So let's copy that, come here, add it, and format it. And if you scroll down a bit, it says we need to add the Spring Boot starter OAuth to client as well as a dependency. But if you look at our pom file, it's already added because when I created the starter project, I selected OAuth to client library, so it already got added. So you can skip this step. And now scroll down a bit and you'll see add a new GitHub app. So this is where we are going to make some changes. So this blog actually explains how to integrate Spring Boot with GitHub as the OpenID Connect provider, but in our case, we are going to use Auth0 as the OpenID Connect provider. So let's go back to this core configuration documentation. So as I said earlier, if you have already opened this page, you go to the Auth0 login page, click core configuration. Now scroll down a bit and come to the section where it talks about configuring a custom provider properties. So come here and copy this. Again, we will keep making changes to all these things, which I will be explaining in this video. So just copy that, paste it here. And this sample configuration is for Okta. So let's just rename it as Auth0 registration, Auth0 provider, Auth0. And we will replace these values for client ID, client secret, and we will be removing these things and replacing with a totally different property, which I will explain again. So we have done the basic setup, and now let's switch to the Auth0 management console and create an application profile for this Spring Boot web app. As I said earlier, when I try to log in using Auth0 from my Spring Boot web app, Auth0 must know from where the authentication request is coming. So that's where we need to create. That's why we need to create an application profile. So let's name it as SP client, which basically is a Spring Boot client. Select regular web applications and create. So go to settings and scroll down and you will see allowed callback URLs. So here we need to give the callback URL of our Spring Boot web app. So what is a callback URL? If you look at this diagram, if you look at the step number 6, after the user enters the credentials and Auth0 validates the credentials, Auth0 must redirect back to my web application, which is my Spring Boot web app, with an authorization code in the query parameter request, the query string request parameter. So in order for Auth0 to redirect to the Spring Boot web app, it must know the URL, right? And that is the callback URL that we are going to configure here. And in order to find the format of this URL, let's again go back to this blog. And if you look at here, this is the callback URL in the case of GitHub. So copy this link address, paste it here, and change this to Auth0. And the reason I'm changing this to Auth0 is this value should match. It must match with whatever we gave here in the application.yaml registration, which is Auth0. So this is the callback URL for the Spring Boot web app that we are building here as part of this demo. And scroll up, and here you will see the client ID and client secret. Copy that, replace it here. Copy the client secret, replace it here. Now let's delete this and add a totally new property called, again, come back to your Spring Boot security documentation. I know it's a bit confusing going back and forth, but uh, once it starts working, you will understand why we need to do that. But so go ahead and go to your open your Spring Boot security documentation and scroll up, and you will see this table where it explains all the different properties that are supported by the Spring Boot application.yaml or application.properties. So here you see a property called issuer-URI, right? Copy that property, and if you scroll down here, you can see a useful tip, where it says you can configure your client registration by using the discovery of an OpenID Connect provider's configuration endpoint and or an authorization server metadata endpoint. using the issuer URI property. So if you look at this one, I will undo it. You have multiple URLs here called authorization URI, token URI, user info URI, all those things, JWK URI. So you can configure all these individual URIs from Auth0, or what you can do is just give this issuer URI, and springboot framework will automatically read all these URIs from that issuer URI, and I will let you know how it happens. So go back to your Auth0 console, actually save changes, because we updated the allowed callback URL and I didn't save the changes. Just now I saved it. So don't forget to save the changes, and later on when you try to access the login page, it will not work and you will it will throw an error. Scroll down to the bottom of the page of your Auth0 management console for that particular application profile. Select advanced settings, endpoints, and here you see a endpoint called OpenID configuration. And here you can see all the endpoints like device authorization URL, OAuth token URL, OAuth user info URL, your JSON web key set. So again, I will undo here. So you can copy each of these URLs and enter, like authorization URL to your authorization, token URL to your token, OAuth token URL. But the easiest way to do is use that issuer URI parameter, and let's get that issuer URI by copying this. Open a new tab, enter that URL. So here you can see your issuer URI. Copy this issuer URI, paste it here. That's it. So what Springboot framework will do is it will automatically append this well-known -OpenID configuration to that to this issuer URI that I entered here, and it will read this JSON response and automatically load this authorization endpoint, token endpoint, all the values. So you can look at this authorization endpoint, it exactly matches with the authorization URL here, which is here, right? So, so this is the easiest way to configure. So it's up to you how you want to configure, but this is the easiest way to configure. So now the basic configuration is done. So let's do one thing. Let's now start the application and see what happens. And I'm going to use Mozilla for testing, and I'm using Chrome for all the configurations and the Spring Tool suite for building the web app. Right click, run as Spring Boot app. So if you are using IntelliJ or Eclipse, there might be a different option. Just follow that option, like whatever they suggest. So the application started. Actually, I missed one more step. Let me stop it. So in the case of OpenID Connect, we need to pass scope parameter, which I missed here. So again, if you go back to this documentation, here you can see the scope. So you have to mention the list of scopes that are required for the OpenID Connect protocol. So in order to initiate the OpenID Connect authentication with Auth0, you need to pass these scopes: OpenID, profile. So these are the bare minimum scopes that you need to pass. But if you want the user's email address back in the ID token, you need to pass the email scope as well. So enter this scope parameter here, a scope property here, and enter this value: OpenID plus profile plus email, if you want email as well in the ID token. Now let's again restart the application. The application started. Now let's go to our Mozilla browser and type localhost colon 8080. It automatically redirected to the Auth0 login page. because there is no session. Like once I log in, it will establish an application session for the Spring Boot web app. I already have a test user created, Cognito test. Like I created it for a different video where I integrated with Cognito. So I already have a user called Cognito test user. So you can see it here. You can go to user management, users. Oh, I didn't save changes again. Okay, I will save it. So I already have multiple users here. Test user one at example.com, Cognito test user one. So you can create a new user either using the console or using the Auth0 APIs. Just make sure you create a new user. And if you want to update any attributes in that user, you can call Auth0's update user API. You can search for those APIs in the Auth0 documentation, and they have very good documentation on how to do that. So I'm going to use this user. Click continue. So when I try to access this Spring Boot application for the very first time, Auth0 asks for my permission, whether it is okay to share my profile details and my email address with this application, which is the Spring Boot web app. So this is part of the OpenID Connect protocol. And in some cases, what I have observed is some identity provider products show this consent screen, some providers don't show. So it behaves in different way, but it's actually a very good thing that Auth0 is showing the consent screen. So here you can either decline if you feel you are not comfortable in sharing your profile details and email address with this application, then you can decline access or you can click accept. So here I'm clicking accept and I logged into my home page. So how I know I logged into my home page? I just got a demo text here, but I don't see any other details like a username or a email address, nothing, right? So that's what we are going to do in the next step. We are going to add some, uh, like we are going to enhance our application to add the user details in this page by reading the user details from the ID token. So let's again go back to this Spring Boot web application. Click this button to stop the server because we are going to modify the code. Open this Java class and go back to your blog. And if you scroll down a bit, we already completed the integration. So the authentication layer is already added. What we are going to do is now add some logic to our application to read the user details and print it in that page. So go to this section called add a welcome page. Again, you can go through the details here, but let's just quickly go through these steps. Copy this, go to your index.html, and below the body tag, below your div, add it and format it. Scroll down and copy this script tag, come here, add it. And now we need to add a user endpoint to read the user details. So if you look at the script tag, actually what it is doing is it is calling a user endpoint in the backend, which in turn will return the user details. And then it will use that user details to print the user name, the user's name in the page. So we need to add a backend endpoint for this slash user URL. So go to this Java class again. And in order to expose an endpoint, we need to add this REST controller annotation. Like you can create a totally new Java class and add it, but this is just for demo purpose. So I'm adding it in the main application class, but the best practice is to actually add a new Java class. So maybe, okay, maybe we can do that. I will actually do that. I will call it as user controller. And let's wait for some time actually like I already did a control shift O or a command shift O depending on which OS you are in. That will actually import this package, this class. Yes. So the REST controller is added. Copy this. Copy this. And again do a control shift O or command shift O. Again, in different IDs, it's different. So you can see all these classes got imported. And now you have a user endpoint which is being called from here in your JavaScript. So it will call this endpoint. What this endpoint does is basically it gets the user details from the principal object. And if you are wondering how this principal object gets populated, that is the beauty of Spring Boot framework. It actually reads the ID token, it creates this object, and it automatically passes this object to this method. So you don't have to do any major updates in your source code to get this user details. So that's the beauty of using a frameworks like Spring Boot. Otherwise, you need to write the logic for each and every step. So save it, restart the application. I'm going to clear the cookies. So I have this plugin, Mozilla plugin for clearing the cookies. You can install this plugin or you can go to the Mozilla settings and clear the cookies for this local host as well as in Auth0. So now I will do one more thing. So I have another plugin called SAML Tracer, which is a very handy plugin to trace all the browser calls. So you can even use the Mozilla developer tools for doing that. So whichever you want, like this plugin is very handy, especially if you are using SAML protocol. But even in this case where you are using OpenID Connect protocol, it is very handy and very useful for tracing the browser calls. So now when I refresh, it will redirect to Auth0. And here, let's see what happens. So when I refresh the page, it redirected to Auth0. So this is the redirect. You can see this is the Auth0 URL and here are the parameters. Response type code, all those things. So if you see this diagram, when I refreshed, it did the step number 2 and step number 3. Now I'm going to do the step number 4, which is submitting the user credentials. So I already have the credentials. Click continue. See, this time it didn't show the consent screen because that will happen only in the first login attempt. Once you give permission to the identity provider that it is okay to share your profile details along with your email address to this particular application, it will not keep showing that consent screen again and again. So now again we will see the browser calls. So when I enter the credentials, Auth0 validated the credentials in that everything happens in the backend. You can't see it in the browser trace, but this is the main step. So here it returned back to my Spring Boot web application URL, which is localhost colon 8080 login OAuth2 code Auth0. If you remember, this is the URL that we configured in the allowed callback URLs in that application profile in Auth0. And here in this diagram, it is the step number 6, where it redirects back to the Spring Boot web app. And remaining things happen in the background, like calling the token endpoint in step number 7, 8, validating the token endpoint and displaying the home page. Here you can see the user details, which is my Cognito test user 1, which is the user name. Now let's quickly do one more thing. I will add a debug point here. Let's see what are all the attributes available in this principal object. I will start the server in debug mode. Yeah. So this time I'm not going to clear the cookies. I will just refresh, but you won't see the Auth0 login page. And the reason is there is already an established session, right? So you already logged into this application. There is already a session, and the session is maintained based on the cookies. If I delete the cookies, it will again redirect back to Auth0. Again, you need to re-log in, and again, you need to come back here. Let's just refresh it and see what happens. So it came to this debug endpoint, and here you can see the principal object and you can see the attributes. So here you can see the attributes like sub Auth0. So copy this, go to your Auth0 console screen and select this user. This is the user that I profile that I used for login. Just Control F and find. So if you look at this user ID, this is the value that gets added in the sub claim of your ID token. And then you have the first name, the last name, everything you can see here. Like if you go to this raw JSON, you can see my given name as Cognito, family name as test user one, full name as Cognito test user one. You can see all these attributes here. And if you scroll to the end, you will see the email address as well, which is cognitotesteduser@example.com. Yeah, you can see it here. And the email verified is false. So let's just go through it, and yeah, I'm logged in as Cognito test user one. So we are done with the full end-to-end setup, that is building a Spring Boot web app from scratch, configuring that web app profile in Auth0, and then integrating Spring Boot web app with Auth0 using the OpenID Connect protocol. So I'm sure you will face some issues because there are multiple steps involved here. But the point is, once you understand this diagram, it is very, very easy. These configuration steps are secondary. You need to first understand this flow. And once you understand it, it's just a matter of doing the configuration. And if you face any issues, you need to just debug, or if you are not able to find the root cause, just post your questions in my YouTube video comments, and I will try my best to reply back and resolve the issue. Again, please don't forget to subscribe to this channel and support this channel. And thank you for watching this video.